When I was a child, I spoke as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. These words of the Apostle Paul in his first letter to the Corinthians were referenced by President Barack Obama on Inauguration Day in the new president's first address to the American nation. But what if you were never allowed to be a child? What if, as far back as you could remember, your life was a life of sadness, deprivation, and horror? How do you put away childish things if you've never had the chance to play? How do you become a man, as Paul says? How do you grow up if you've never had the chance to be a child? Many psychologists would say that unless you have been allowed to be a child, to play, to babble, to explore, to try things out while feeling parental admiration and the encompassing envelope of parental love, you cannot successfully negotiate the transition from childhood to adolescence and from adolescence to adulthood. If you've never been allowed to be a child, you will never become a genuine adult. The principal destroyer of childhood is brutality. Sometimes brutality descends in the form of bombs from the air that can wipe out houses and parents, aunts and uncles, children older and children younger, leaving perhaps one small, perhaps mangled child to cope alone with a bombed-out life. This is what happened recently to many children who live in the Gaza Strip between Israel and Egypt. What kind of adults will such children become? Crippled inwardly and outwardly, they're likely to be either excessively timid, fearful people, or hateful, brutal people. And who could blame them for becoming something less than they would have been had they been allowed a normal course of development? Sometimes brutality hits a child more privately, less dramatically, but just as effectively as a bomb. When it comes in the form of a hateful parent, a parent who demeans and belittles a child, a parent who takes out the frustrations of adult life on a helpless child, a parent who constantly humiliates, beats, and even tortures the helpless body of a child. If such a child survives childhood, and many do not, he or she is only too likely to grow up to be another humiliator, another beater, another torturer, and so continues through time from one generation to the next, the dreadful syndrome of man's inhumanity to man. Where do such children end up? Sometimes they manage to secure for themselves positions from which they can work considerable harm to others, positions that give them wide latitude to control the innocent and the vulnerable. Most people go with the best and purest of motives into the helping professions, teaching, nursing, ministry, but there are always a few who hope to hurt, and for this reason we must all be vigilant always. Not a few of the children, especially the males who have never had a childhood, grow up to be lawbreakers who sooner or later find themselves in prison. I have a friend named Joe Loya. Today, Joe is a respected journalist and writer, but once upon a time he was a bank robber known as the Beirut Bandit, who for many years was highly successful robbing banks up and down California. He was finally caught and sent to prison, where he spent not a few years. As he told me recently, I never met a man in prison who had not been beaten by his father or his mother, or abused or abandoned. After his own beloved mother died unexpectedly, little Joe was beaten bloody for years by a father who couldn't cope with his loss. Rather than taking the trouble to intervene effectively in the lives of such abused children and rescue them, We as a society often just wait till they are old enough to break the law. Then we lock them up. How creative of us, how responsible, how mean and cruel and unforgiving. Let me tell you about another friend of mine, Dominique Green. Dominique spent his teen years as a petty mugger and sometime drug pusher. Finally, having just turned 18, he was tried for capital murder, convicted and sentenced to death in the state of Texas. Was Dominique guilty of murder? I don't think so. I think he was just guilty of being an abused kid who had no resources to protect him from the charges made by a district attorney who wanted a conviction and didn't care how he got it. When Dominique was picked up by the police, he had been living for 3 years in a storage bin that he rented with his drug money. Why was Dominique living in a storage bin from the age of 15? Because his parents had abandoned him. This after years of torture by a mother who used to hold Dominique's right hand over the gas flame when she disapproved of something he had done. Dominique's father was a drug addict. His mother was an alcoholic and prostitute. She was also schizophrenic and had multiple personalities, some of them harrowing. Over the 12 years Dominique spent on death row, he blossomed into a beautiful human being, a wholly functioning adult, far beyond the expectations of most psychologists. He became a legal expert and was constantly helping other inmates with their cases. He became an avid reader and student, an excellent writer, and even an editor who created a fascinating anthology of prisoners' writings. One book that especially impressed Dominique was a book by Desmond Tutu, the retired Archbishop of Cape Town, South Africa. The book was entitled No Future Without Forgiveness, and it's about Archbishop Tutu's experiences as chairman of South Africa's unique experiment, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, during whose sessions perpetrators of political violence were encouraged to tell the truth about what they had done in the course of the apartheid era, and the victims of that violence and their families were encouraged to forgive those who repented of their violence. Dominique was deeply impressed by the book and realized that this was the path he and his fellow inmates must take. He pressed the Archbishop's book on anyone who would have it. Under Dominique's leadership, many, perhaps most, of the inmates on death row in the state of Texas forgave everyone who had harmed them, and insofar as they could, asked forgiveness from those they had harmed. Dominique believed he had a vocation to inspire the kids who turn up on death row to drop their petty hatreds and to morph into larger, more generous human beings. In the same way that older inmates, since executed, once provided spiritual models for him to follow. In my first meeting with Dominique, I was able to tell him that Archbishop Tutu was a friend of mine. I doubt anything else I could possibly have said would have impressed him so much, and he wanted me to tell him everything I knew about the great man. So I was able to tell him that despite his widely acknowledged monumentality, the Archbishop was kind of short. That he took himself lightly and had a killer sense of humor. But most of all, Dominique and I spent much of our conversation admiring the sublime courage of Desmond Tutu, who with his wonderful wife, Leah, and their 4 children, had lived for decades under the constant threat of assassination, yet never failed to speak the truth boldly to those who did not wish to hear it. Everyone here tonight, and the whole world, your grace is permanently in your debt.